Mommy? Daddy? Where are we going? Surprise! We're taking you to Disneyland! I squealed and hugged both of you, nearly crying tears of joy. Thanking you endlessly, going to Disneyland has always been my dream. I want to go and see the pretty princesses and prince. And the magical castle. Mommy, why are you crying? It's tears of joy, baby. I hugged both of you once again. A hug, smile on my face before getting in the car. This scene is replayed in my head while I wait for you. It's starting to get dark, and I'm scared. Mommy! Daddy! I cried out. All I can hear are a few dogs barking from the woods. I've been here for hours already. When will you realize you forgot me here? When will we stop at the rest stop area? She was young and I was young, and never a care had we. Of all the worries of this world that we might never again be seen. We wandered one day on the paths where few any longer tread, out to a home of an old man, 25 years dead. He had been a brilliant scientist, the papers did proclaim, but like all men upon this world, time closed out his frame. He had cares for the moral wealth, if so, we scarce could tell. His home was ancient, sere and lean, its walls an empty shell. The green tiles of the roof decayed, the garden plants were frayed. The white wood walls grew thick with moss, after he in his grave was laid. The first floor creaked, its wooden boards had been decayed and silence slept, towards rotten stairs, and up to heights my beating heart it leapt. Alice was her name, I think, though sanity implores me not to think the fact that I led her through that door. I berated her to follow me, up to the second floor, and though I was terrified, my fright pushed me on the more. We walked up to those steps, into the attic, where the box we found. It sat alone and deathly quiet, the room empty shell all around. On the side were scrawled these numbers, 433. In that box, a thing so dark that it should never be. Alice I led to that box and opened it to see what laid in that unholy darkness which drew both her and me. Alice and I looked inside, and the darkness saw a horrifying crawling nightmare living inside that maw. Centipedes and beetles crawling inside, of the thousands of them swarming, never a thought to spare. I'm not sure why I did it. I thought it was funny then. Alice was leaning over to the side, and I thought to push her in. She yelled and screamed. I picked the lid up off the floor. I'm not sure what I said so long ago as I closed the door. When her voice died to silent, with something cornered dread, I opened up that box, fearing to find her dead. My cruelty repaid, I can't describe the sight. I ran home and told my parents that Alice disappeared that night. That was true, I still know, although I pushed it back. Alice was gone away, vanished through some tracks, which leads through the worlds unheard of, which fall through a madman's dream, which even to the blind man, the thought on sight seems. The box I know unsuredly was no box at all. That man who owned it had hastily thought to close it calls. He had hidden away in the attic above his head that thing which to him had been a source of dread. It could not destroy the thing which hell had borne after a 40 century. I doubt it's even worn. A brilliant man he was, but the devil did delude even Dr. Faust away with his cunning wiles. I know how to open it. After 25 years, I know that I should go there and face all my fears. 8 times at most would be needed to find whatever is left, to find Alice there, where she had starved to death. But something taunts me in my mind, something that would never leave. What if I opened up that box, and my reason was deceived? For those things that crawl, they lived in there for who knows how long. The rain it falls on other planes, could she be there alone? I wonder now whether if I go and the darkness did combine. What exactly will I find, if it kept Alice alive? You are home alone, and you hear on the news about a profile of a murderer who is on the loose. You look out the sliding glass doors to your backyard, and you notice a man standing out in the snow. He fits the profile of the murderer exactly, and he is smiling at you. You gulp, picking up the phone to your right and dialing 911. You look back at the glass as you press the phone to your ear and notice he is much closer to you now. You then drop the phone in shock. There are no footprints in the snow. It's his reflection. I didn't even notice I was in hell my first year. Everyday life seemed the same, minus one particular detail. Nothing good ever happens. Ever. I had a secure job, relationship, and life. It fell apart. All those little doubts I had about myself ate away at me until they were full-blown paranoia. Then it became reality. My company kept suffering loss after loss until the problems were eventually pinpointed to being solely my fault. After I lost my job, I lost my fiancé to my best friend, and no one seemed to be on my side. Every person in my life was cold and distant. Even the little things didn't matter or awful. Food was always tasted terrible. My favorite shows were canceled, and something in my apartment always needed to be repaired. Each day was cold with rainy overcast, and the night were eerie dark and no stars or moonlight. There was absolutely no enjoyment in hell. But the first year is child's play compared to the rest. Silence. During the second year, I came to 2 possible conclusions. The first, that I had gone completely insane, and the second was that I was no longer in the same world I was born into. It started in the morning when I powered up the TV. The morning news was on, but I couldn't hear anything. I tuned the volume up to max, still nothing. I set the remote down, and I couldn't even hear it hit the table. I started to panic, and immediately assumed I lost my hearing. I spoke aloud, but I was able to hear my voice just fine. I walked around to the corner store. Everyone stopped. They were doing, and they looked directly at me. Everything froze, like time was standing still. My stomach turned. A sea of people stared in my directions, but their faces were a jumble of fears. Eyes, nose, and mouth were all swirled in a mess of flesh, hair, and teeth. Even if I wanted to speak with one of these monstrous, I couldn't. They remained still, dead. Silence was everywhere I went, and every person stopped and turned in my direction, always watching my every move with their misplaced eyeballs. Hell was studying me. It only got worse. Seclusion. If you ever wish you could be in complete seclusion, I'll be the first to tell you it's not worth it. One day out of nowhere, I was completely alone. No jumbled-faced people, animal cars, or life in general. The world was a hollow reminder of what used to be. With no plan in mind, I started wondering the depressed state to wear on me. Always alone, I had no idea what was going on or whether I was. Eventually it was too much, and loneliness weighted me down. I gave up. I jumped off the tallest building I could find. I felt the entire impact of the fall. I heard my bones shatter. But death never came. After 3 agonizing days of laying on the cold black asphalt, the excruciating pain started to fade and my body remained intact, even though it should have been completely mangled. Shadows. The suicide attempt seemed to accelerate things, but I was awarded with one luxury, and I can use the term lightly. I could hear sounds again. It wasn't worth much in an empty world, but nevertheless, it had returned. But like everything in hell, there was a reason. My hearing allowed the shadows to terrify me on unimaginable levels. I'm not really sure what these things are, but I could try to do my best to describe them. You know that feeling when you're walking in the dark room, or going down a flight of stairs in a creepy basement? The feeling that something is right behind you, so you start moving a little faster to get the light, multiplying the fear by 100. I would catch glimpses of them out of the corner of my eye. Tall, black, humanoid figures darting quickly behind buildings of the trees. I could feel them getting closer. The creepy paranoia consumed me. One night, I was taking a shortcut through the apartment complex. The entrance doors were open and flickered fluorescent lights, particularly illuminating the narrow ground floor hallway. Halfway down the corridor, the lights went out, and the darkness washed over me. The hair of the back of my neck stood straight up, and I had an unmistakable feeling of something behind me. I prepared to run, but it was too late. With a high-pitched howl, one of the shadows had me, its cold, dead hands wrapped around my arms as it sank its teeth into the top of my skull. The pain was indescribable. I thrashed around in agony as more shadows emerged from the open apartment doors. In a fit of my pain and terror, I pulled my head free from the fangs and stumbled to my feet. I ran what seemed like hours. I learned quickly that traveling in the evening was no longer an option. I barricaded myself in any shelter I could find. Every night the shadows were always placed outside the door until they would leave each morning as the dull gray clouds covered the sunlight drove them off. Abyss. Eventually my nomadic lifestyle was impossible to continue. I unlocked the door of the small 2-bedroom house I had been sleeping in and walked outside. It was raining. It was always raining, despite all that I had been through. And what I saw took my complete surprise. The first change was the gates. Black iron bars had surrounded the neighborhood. They extended from the ground and rose impossibly high into the sky. I was trapped. The second thing I saw was a jumbled face of people that had returned. Dozens of them were lined up on the streets in perfectly straight rows. They were different though, in the groups of 4, dressed in black robes. They walked hand in hand towards a massive swimming pool-sized hole in the ground. Without hesitation, a group of 4 would fall in, and after a few seconds, the next group would follow suit. I turned around to head back inside the home, but I couldn't. The iron bars had somehow closed in, and they were just a few feet away. I looked back towards the people and saw the bars across the streets had moved in closer as well. It was pushing me towards the hole. I panicked and grabbed the bars with both of my hands and began to shake them. They didn't bulge. I started to running to the entire perimeter looking for any way out. The bars began to move, ripping through the earth and concrete, pushing me closer to the dark abyss. By this time, the rows of people were gone. I planted my feet on the ground and began pushing with all my strength. The bars continued to force me closer to the endless hole despite my efforts. After a few moments, it was too late. I was right on the edge. I remember crawling at the ground, begging for help. I accepted the inevitable fact that I was going to descend into the darkness. But just before I fell, a flash of light blinded me. Electric pain filled my chest. I woke up in an emergency room back on Earth. According to the paramedics, I was only dead for a few seconds. I began rambling about all the things I have seen and been through. No one seemed to acknowledge or believe me. This story is not a lesson. I am not telling you to change your life or be a better person. This is a warning. If nothing is going well in your life, it might not be coincidence. You may be in hell. Many sailor, no matter how brave and fearless, knows how well unpredictable and deadly the sea can be. Before every setting of the sails, a prayer goes throughout the crew, praying to God for safety of their voyage. A wise man knows the prayers are not always answered, and many men have traveled to the briny depths of the sea, never to be seen again. Some men say they had managed to cheat death in those moments with a ritual that may not be worth living for later. The ritual is fairly simple, but not one to want to use unless they were in the moral peril and they know it. Providing what they are not sinking fast enough in the water to choke their words, a man must repeat the words, "Devil take my soul across the sinks. God has abandoned me," 3 times on top of your lungs. If he truly puts himself and his soul into it, the ferryman shall come, no matter how much the waves raged across and toss. His ship shall not be churned, nor shall be capsized. The man shall feel his wrist grabbed and pulled into the boat. From there, he will not feel the waves rocking him. He will feel no hunger, no thirst, only the breath in his lungs and wind blow softly across his wet face. It is important that the man does not look up into the eyes. This is because calling him out is a trick. You see, the ferryman will not take a soul across Styx without payment. He will hear him speak, asking for payment, which he asks. He must proclaim that he is without payment and needs to get it home. The ferryman will begin to row to the sailor's home shore. He cannot look at him at all the entire way. If it takes 3 days and 3 nights, it will not matter, because it's the ferryman look into your eyes. He will know you are lying and return you to the waters to drown. When you finally reach the shore, the sailor must thank him and tell him he will return shortly. The sailor can never return to the sea after this. The ferryman will never come to the shore to collect, only be there by the waters awaiting his payment. If a sailor ever does set his foot aboat again, he and all the men on it shall perish in a violent and destructive manner. Be warned, though, one cannot outrun the ferryman forever. I know a man who is in his last years and fears closing his eyes at night, lest he passed from the world and his soul met the ferryman once more. He feels the grip around his wrist tighter and tighter at night, with each dream when he finally falls into sleep and sees a monstrous face looking at him enraged. No one truly cheats the ferryman. He is simply far more patient than most realize. As I opened the gate with the bolt cutters, I slowly walked in. A large group of people stood before me. They were wearing the same clothes, and they were starved to the point you could see their bones cease behind their skin. A man no older than 20 dragged his feet towards me. He stood in front of me and gave me a hug. He was crying. I didn't know what to do. I kept repeating, "It's okay." After 2 minutes, he let me go, and the man walked off crying. I continued to walk to the building looking like it was built into the ground. I opened the door and immediately put my hands over my mouth because the stench I smelled. I turned on my flashlight and I saw people living inside starved as well. I walked out and saw the same man that had been hugging me before, carrying his father or grandfather, who was even worse than the rest that I've seen. More people walked out of those buildings. Many people were stacked along the place dead. This hell was surrounded by the high barbed wire fence. I saw an old woman that had a bullet in the back of her head, and I also noticed the dead bodies, that there were branded markings on their arms. This place is hell. White and blue shirts, hats, caps, and pants. That's all they were wearing. Then I heard a faint voice. I turned around and heard, "Lock these people back up again. We have to keep them contained," said a man in a green uniform. "Yes, sir," I said. "Please do not try to run. Nobody has been able to evade me yet. I will remain the last of your fears, unable to be conquered. I will blind you, weaken your spirit, break your bones, and tear you apart. I will be sure to erase every memory you ever had or ever cherished. I will see to that you forget everyone you know and everyone you love. But not worry, I'm sure they will forget about you too. You are nothing to me. Do you not understand? I wish I could have said, I have enjoyed having you around. Your old friend, Time. Once your spinal cord is cut and your head is severed, you will continue to experience the full spectrum of pain without the heavenly dun of shock, absorbing chemicals which are the back of there with your party. You cannot talk, of course, but you can move your lips and appear to scream, and focus and blink your eyes, as provided by dozens of death health deals. A severed head is conscious, and in some ways, conscious. The head knows it's been picked up by other hair and shown to the ground. The head sees the crowd, hears the crowd, smells the breath of the executioner, thinks happy thoughts. Cannot believe how long 40 seconds is, because 40 seconds is how long the average head remains fully aware, if not alive. 40 seconds of indescribable pain and horror. They hanged John Farrell at the dawn amidst the marketplace. At dusk came Adam Brand to spat upon his face. Ho, neighbors all! Spak Adam Brand, see ye John Farrell's fate. 'Tis proven here hempt noose is stronger than man's hate. For hear he not John Farrell's vow to avenge upon me, come life or death? See how he hangs high on the gallows trees, yet never a word that people spoke in fear and the wild surprise. For the grisly corpse raised up its head and stared with starlight eyes, and with a strange motion, slow and stiff, and pointed at Adam Brand and Chamberlain down the gibbet tree, the noose within its hand. The gaping mouth stood Adam Brand like a statue carved of stone, till the man laid dead. A clammy hard hand on his shoulder bone. Then Adam shrieked, with a soul in hell, the red blood left in his face, and he reeled away in a drunken run through the screaming marketplace, and close behind the dead man came with a face like a mummy's mask, and the dead joints cracked, and the stiff legs creaked with their untoned task. Men fled before flying Tuan, or shanked the bated breath, and they saw on the face of Adam Brand the seal set there by death. He reeled by buckling legs and fled, yet on off he fled. So through the shuddering marketplace the dying fled, the dead, at the riverside of Adam Brand, with a scream that rent the skies. Across him John Farrell's corpse, nor ever the Tuan did rise. There are no wounds on Adam Brand, but the barrow of the cold and damp, for the fear of death, blown out of life, in which blown out of lamps. His lips were wreathed in horrid grin, like a fiend's on Satan's coals. And the men that looked on his face that day, his stares was haunted their souls. Such the fate of Adam Brand, a strange, unheartly fate. For the strong, the death of hemp noose, are the fires of dead man's hate. Do you know those dreams, the ones that are so real, so vivid they scare you, but when you wake up you try to remember them, but you just can't? The reason is he doesn't want you to. He has no name, but I like to call him the Dream Stealer. At night, when you fall asleep, that's when he comes. He waits until you're quiet, and then he enters your dream. When he gets in, he likes to have a little fun. He loves to screw with your head. He changes your dream, and when I say change, I mean it makes it the worst nightmare, a nightmare you cannot escape. He makes you dream what he wants you to dream. When he gets in your head, he takes over. It makes everything his. It makes sure you don't remember a thing. He wipes your mind clean, leaving no evidence of your existence. When you wake up tomorrow, look around and you might see him before he steals your dream and erases your memories. Before you fall asleep tonight, set up a camera, but hide it well. For if he sees it, you're dead. He doesn't like for his face to be seen. I saw him once, but I wish I hadn't. He has no hair at all. There are scars on both sides of his ears. On his right hand, at the tip of his fingers are cut off. He's missing a left eye, and most noticeably, the thing is that his head was on backwards, with stitches holding it, like he had sewn it on himself. I have a warning, do not look at him his one eye. It will drive you insane, and you'll end up like me. Thousands of years ago, the world as we know it was covered in dark, foreboding forest. Within these ancient forests lurked unstrange and frightening monsters which would become the basis of most of the world's mythology, folklores, and fairy tales. Within the ancient forests hid man-eating beasts, vicious hags, and boogeymans of all shapes and sizes, all of which died long before the modern era. They exist only in imagination of those who have kept the wisdom of the ancestors alive in the song, dance, and written stories. Yet every now and then, the ancient forests return, spiriting people away from their homes or work, entrapping them within the twisting neither. These people were presumed missing by the world and rarely return, and even when they do, they are often without memory of the means of identification. Within the ancient forest, their souls walked into sleep pursued by many dark forces that lurk within. There is no reason behind these events, no purpose, and no grand design. This perhaps is what the most frightening to modern idea that it is in our so-called age of reason, people can be taken away in the flash of an eye to a realm beyond our own. A realm which refused to play by our limited notion of reality. You can never tell when it will occur or when will it be taken next. It is random as if death itself. No search party could find you. No priest or holy man could pray for you. Friends and family would be powerless. This is no fairy tale, but this is the fate of 100 every days. How, you may ask, did you protect yourself? The answer is simple. You don't. Live every moment of your day as if it was your last. Find happiness in the smallest of things and do not be quick to be angered. For this world is fleeting, and no one knows what awaits us when our time finally comes. I've worked at a Subway store for about 4 years now. Lame, I know. But it's great money. Relatively easy, and truly made some long-lasting friends while working there. Anyone that works in any sort of fast food shop is bound to have their fair share of horror stories. A friend of mine that used to work at McDonald's almost got tasered when she was to take a customer's money through the drive-thru. Crazy shit. Anyways, apart from being robbed once a while, working and your general is drunk, I never had much of a story to tell until last week. It was Tuesday afternoon. I was on until 5 p.m. and having to start work at day at 6:30. I couldn't wait until the hell out of there. It was 3:30 when the other girl that was on started complaining she felt really sick. I told her I would be fine working until 5 myself, so she left. We aren't supposed to do that, and I probably shouldn't have. But what can you do? So she left and time trickled by. We were dead as anything, so I got pretty excited when a customer walked through. He looked like he was in his late 40s, had balding, black hair, and ridiculously thick glasses, and a very sad demeanor about him. I greeted him with the usual, "Hi! How are you today?" in the most cheerful tone I could muster. "Fine," was what all he can manage to mumble out. Aren't customers awesome? He began ordering his sub, a process that usually takes under a minute depending on how decisive the customer is. This particular customer, however, was choosing each of every aspect of the sandwich with such care, it was like he was going to be his last meal in the world. After 5 minutes of debate of which cheese he wanted, I whisked a sub into the toaster. I hated the awkward silence during toasting time, so I started sparking up a conversation with the customer. I began asking how his day had been so far, and he had told me it was one of the worst days of his life. The day before, I had to experience a shit kicker of a day and began retelling my experience. How it started with a 10-kilogram box of chicken falling onto my head, how my phone fell out of my work locker, and the cold, hateful tiles obliterated the screen. How I then had to catch a bus from home, only to realize 20 minutes in I was on the wrong bus and a complete opposite side of the town, and how I ended up walking home in the pouring rain to find I was locked out. Real shit day. To my surprise, the grumpy, indecisive man was now howling of laughter and tears pouring down his face. Now I admit, it was kind of funny, but not that funny. Although I had it glad to see he had some sort of happiness in him, I finished up his sandwich, and he went on and sat into the restaurant happily chomping away. 10 minutes later, he came up to the counter and asked if he could borrow a pen. I handed him one and he took a napkin and went back to his table. A further 10 minutes later, he returned the pen and now scribbled on a folded up napkin. He handed them both to me and asked me to promise him not to read the napkin until he was out of the shop and out of view. I gringily agreed, and he left the shop and walked out to the highway that is in front of my store. I watched the car screeched around him as he walked without a care in the world to the middle of the grass island that separates the two sides of. For a few very long minutes, he stared down the highway on oncoming traffic like he was judging when a good time it could be crossed back over. But that couldn't be it. I thought, what the hell is he doing? As if he heard my thought, the man turned to me and the biggest grin plastered across his face and started waving, a bit confused and very creeped out. I waved back. It was then that he stepped out in front of a log truck. I've never seen someone get hit by a vehicle before, and I wish I never did too again. I shoved the napkin back into my pocket, leapt over the counter, and bolted outside. His body was lying 200 meters up the highway. People were screaming and crying. It was total chaos. I ran to him. With a small group of people were gathered. I kneeled in front of his badly mangled body and immediately started bawling my eyes out. How was it that just 5 or so minutes ago, this man was standing in front of me, well and truly alive, and now he was dead and almost unrecognizable? It was then that I remembered the napkin. This is what it said. To my dear friend, fellow human. Today I decided that is going to be my last day on this horrid earth. It wouldn't be so horrid if my beautiful wife and daughter were still alive. But they're not, and today is the 1-year anniversary of their deaths. 1 fucking year since that idiotic driver crashed into him at 110 kilomiles at an intersection. They did not deserve to die that night, but they did. Since I am not the same person, hell, who could be? I'm just a shell of a former self. Most people don't bother me with me anymore. And I know I came off as rude, but I really didn't think I had any positivity left in life, in my soul. Until today I hadn't laughed or smiled for the matter in years. But you achieved the impossible. You made me a sad old man crying tears of happiness. I wanted to thank you for that. For you have put me on cloud 9 and made me realize that my life isn't all that bad. But this is truly what I want. I need to be with my daughter and my wife. That is just what I'm going to do. So again, thank you for making my year and helping me leave this earth with a smile on my face. P.S. Great sub. You see, I am a simple college student living alone in the apartment. I was very enthusiastic about the release of Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Here in the States, I had purposely locked myself out of all media and the internet side the school purposes. That means no 4chan, no /v/, no Bullpedia, etc. I was always busy with school that year, and being poor at the time, I wasn't able to buy Soul Silver at its launch date. After my school year ended, I ordered a Soul Silver on Amazon. However, it would take weeks for it to arrive. I decided during that time I would replay my Crystal version on my Game Boy Color. However, I realized that long ago my mom threw it away because I told her the save went dead, and I was very upset about it then. She also threw away my silver version, so all I have is my Game Boy Color. As such, I set out to the GameStop and bought a used silver version, and it's only Pokemon game left that they have for the Game Boy Color, $10. Fairly cheap. I went home and started up for the nostalgia trip. However, that's where things started getting bizarre, and most likely the reason why you read this. The Game Freak logo started to come up as normal, but it just froze there. I thought the card was just an error or something, so I turned it off and turned it on. The same thing happened again. I tried pressing A, and it started over and over, and all the buttons, eventually the logo vanished, and there was a black screen for about 5 seconds. Suddenly, rather than going to the usual menu screen, I was already in the game in a previous save file, which was odd, and I was expecting all these cards to have been wiped by a poor battery. Either way, I wasn't complaining, as I would have chosen the continue option to see what the previous guy did anyways. First off, I checked the trainer's information. His name was just Dots. He didn't have much originality. I checked his profile. Apparently he had 999,999 hours put into the game, with all 16 badges, 999.99 Pokédollars, and all 251 Pokemons on the Pokédex. Seeing as he apparently had Mew and Celebi logged also, I'm guessing he either used a Game Genie or was a really hardcore Pokemon player back then. I checked his Pokemon to see what a badass team he had. To my surprise, I saw 5 unknowns and 6 Pokemon named Hurry. I'm thinking that this must have been some cruel joke by some person who had last played the game, but I decided to check the profile of those Pokemons anyways. As expected, they were different letters of unknown, all level 5. I was a bit shaky with the unknown alphabet at the time, but I identified the words that spell out leave. As for the 6th Pokemon, it turned out to be a Cyndaquil. Mind you, this was before there were individualized Pokemon icons. Cyndaquil looked normal, but it was about level 5, with only 1 HP left, with only 2 attacks, Leer and Flash. I don't know why they named him Hurry, but at the time I just disregarded it. The most eerie thing about that, despite the volume being at max, none of the Pokemon had said their usual cries, just pure silence. Having enough of the team, I closed it. I was parked at what appeared to be a room inside a Bellsprout tower. However, for some reason, there were no NPCs around. Even more eerie, there were just a pillar in the middle of the didn't move at all, as if it was just leaning on its side. There was no music at all, and there was no exit or ladder, or at least I thought there wasn't. I walked around for a few minutes, but can't seem to find a way out. This certainly was not a room I've seen in the Bellsprout Tower before. I tried checking my items for an escape rope, but the bag was completely empty. There wasn't any wild Pokemon either. Finally, I managed to find a ladder, which turned out to be behind a pillar. The screen turned back as the music finally started playing. I had sudden chills as I recognized the melody I heard to the theme you can hear when you listen to the radio in Alpha Ruins where the unknown are at. I immediately realized that it wasn't going to load a transition, but rather I was in a dark room and would need flash. Before I took care of that, though, I immediately checked my Pokegear to change the radio to something more pleasant. But it turns out there was no radio card, or even a phone nor time card. There was only a map card, in which Gold, Dot, from the earlier I was calling him from the Gold from now on, was just walking in the midst of black. I recalled that Cyndaquil has Flash, so I turned off my Pokegear and made Cyndaquil use Flash. I didn't see the message saying Hurry has used Flash or anything like that. The room just became lit just like that. And as soon as I regretted, the room was a chilling blood red and linear gray path heading south. The ladder I used to go up and down was not there at all. I had no choice but to head south. The screen got darker every 20 steps I made, until finally I made to the end, which appeared to be a sign. I read the sign, which said, "Turn back now." Suddenly I wanted to answer yes or no, but there was no question asked. I chose yes, as I do not know what it was asking, and the screen went to black, making a ladder climb sound. The unknown radio music stopped, and a few seconds were replaced the not as creepy pokey flute radio music. I was in the another dark room, but I held my breath and used flash again. Suddenly, it had that hurry has fainted, which was odd since I recalled that it had no stat conditions that poisoned on him, and I clearly wasn't in battle. I checked my Pokemon quickly, and suddenly he was no longer in the party. In fact, after a bit of investigation, none of the Pokemon are there, but instead all replaced with level 10 unknown. I did the same thing before and spelled out the unknown, and then the team of unknowns spelled, he died. Either way, after that creepy change, the room was lit and revealed myself in a small room that appeared to be only 4 squares big. The walls of the room were gray bricks, as if it was inside something that was hollowed out. Outside that room appeared to be a bunch of graves similar to the ones in Pokemon Red and Blue. I've walked all around that small room and pressed A, and nothing happened. I've already concluded that this was clearly a hacked game and some sadistic fuck sold it to GameStop. However, my curiosity kept me going and I checked the trainer profile dots again, only to find out that the sprite of gold was missing his arms. He also seemed to appear less smug, but rather seemed more sad and empty in a way that I did not know how to describe. For some reason, it also now said that he has 24 badges, which was clearly impossible. After a few minutes of aimless wandering, my character suddenly spun and did the escape rope spinning animation. Instead of flying up, though, my character spun downward slowly as if he was sinking. After that screen, the music stopped, finally landing the overworld sprite of gold is colored differently now. Instead of the usual red color, he dons the appearance of completely white now, including the skin. It's as if he became straight from the colorless Game Boy game, placed into a colored background of a colored Game Boy Color. I checked his profile, and now while he is as white as the overworld sprites, he lost his legs and he has appeared to be bloody tears from his eyes. It's also said that he has 32 badges, which now starts to disturb me as this change of numbers seem to represent something important. I also checked my Pokemon, which this time contains 5 unknowns and a level 100 Celebi without a nickname. The unknown this time level 15 that spelled up dying. I checked Celebi's profile. It was a shiny Celebi, except there's only half of the sprite. 1 leg, 1 arm, 1 eyeball. It only has 1 attack. Perish Song. The area I was in myself was a sprout tower, which immobile pillar as before, except everything apparently is red now. I walked north through what felt like forever. Eventually I encountered some generic men and women NPCs. They were all lined up in the side of facing a long, slantish pillar in the middle. They were also white and nothing happened. When I tried to speak to them, I kept going on, north until eventually the pillar finally appeared chopped off, and the transparent red in that spot I went up to red without even pressing A. I suddenly engaged and finally in a battle. The music started again, which it sounded like the unknown radio music again, but played backwards. Gold's battle backsprite matches his font, and one of the bloody eyes, white skin, and lack of arms, while red sprite was the same as before in the GSC except transparent. The text simply said, wants to battle, as if he had no name, and both of us only had 1 Pokemon each, which is weird, and I swore I had 6 with the unknown. My shiny Celebi came out conveniently with half of the sprite for the back sprite also. The shiny noise and animation was different, as the sound it made sound like multiple screech attacks used consecutively, Red sent out a seemingly normal male Pikachu, except he is level 255 and his sprite seemed sad and his tears had in his eyes, rather than the usual fight item picked run menu. I only was given one option, to use the attack. Since Celebi only has one, I chose it. Naturally, since Pikachu was 255, he went first. Pikachu used Curse, lowering his speed and increasing his other stats. I'm not even sure if Pikachu could use Curse. Celebi used Perish Song. In 3 turns, both Pokemon gets KO'd. Not like I have a choice. At this point, it didn't even let to go back to fight menu, as the battle just continued without me. Also note that there was no animation at all, for some reason. Pikachu used Flail, which didn't do much damage despite his level and his boost as his health was maxed. Celebi used Perish Song, nothing happened as it was already used. Pikachu used Frustration, which did a shit ton of damage, knocking Celebi down to less than 10 HP. Celebi used Pain Spit, which was a surprise for me as Celebi didn't even have that attack in the first place. Now Celebi and Pikachu have about 150 HP. Pikachu used Mean Look. Not like that did anything. As expected, due to the efforts of the Perish Song, Celebi fainted, except in the text it said Celebi has died, instead of the orderly dropped off the screen animation. The Celebi back sprite just vanished for some reason. The Pikachu was still up even with Perish Song, and it didn't count as my loss. Pikachu used one more different attack beyond the 5 attack limit. Pikachu used Destiny Bond. Afterward, it said Pikachu has died, with a slow faded out animation. Apparently I was the winner, as the transparent red sprite showed up and said dots. At that point, I just freaked out, as that transparent red sprite was suddenly beheaded, leaving nothing but his transparent body. The battle then ended up at the point and faded out along the music. I'm back to the overworld, and another change to the gold sprite. He's now transparent and red's overworld sprite. I quickly checked Gold's profile, where this time there was the only thing that remains of him is his head, with a transparent skin. The head was zoomed in a bit, showing a black void in his eyes. It is now stated that he has now 40 badges. I then backed down and checked my Pokemon. They were all level 20, shiny unknown, which then spelled out no more. I was at what I know now is the next to the end. There was apparently no music playing, but before some reason I felt like something was there that could be heard. I was back in my room in New Bark Town. Maybe finally I get to play this game properly, but who am I kidding? I knew that the sadistic fuck must have done something. I walked around into my room, interacted with things, as I'm a bit afraid to go downstairs to see what was waiting down there. Note, I said walked. As while the background was moving, Gold was not moving his transparent limbs at all while doing so, just floating like those ghosts you see in Diamond and Pearl. As expected, the radio computer and TV did not work, so I had no choice but to go down the stairs. I ended up in the same lower level room of my house. Everything appeared normal except my mom isn't home. After failing to interact with anything in his room, I decided to go outside. To my surprise, that door leading outside at the south didn't work, and instead I was walked straight through to the void. I continued moving south to see what the fuck is going on. My house vanished as if I head south to the void. It was creepy, as when I was entered the void, the outline on Gold's transparent sprite turned white to the contrast with a pitch black. Eventually I reached a white area and Gold's sprite turned black and transparent again. I continued south without thinking of stopping at all. After a long trek south, I finally encountered something. It was Gold's regular sprite. I talked to it. He said goodbye forever, notably with a space in between and forever and dots, and vanished. As that happened, it said question marks, use nightmare, which at that point I could not deny that being possible. Gold did another escape rope animation, spinning slowly downward like before. I'm now back into a small hollow-out room surrounded by graves earlier. Or at least I say, was back there, as no sprites anymore. I tried to walk around, but nothing moved. Not even the wall bumping noise. I checked the trainer profile with absolutely no gold sprites left. It said I have 0 badges, and all the pictures of a Johto gym leaders at the bottom were replaced with skulls. I checked my Pokemon, which were all level 25 unknown. As expected, it spelled out a phrase that I dared to read. I'm dead. As soon as I went back to the overworld, the room I supposedly was in, being covered with the same blocks as the walls, I figured out what that room was when the final text was said. R.I.P. That room was the biggest grave surrounded by other graves. Gold has already been dead. He died presumably a few years after the defeat of Red. He was a younger trainer who, despite his efforts in collecting so many badges in an attempt at becoming a Pokemon Master, was still unable to avoid the fate of death, and his efforts were eventually forgotten by the next generation. I was unable to escape from the text no matter what I pressed. I tried resetting the game, and the same thing happened. At which I then finally decided to give up on the horrible nightmare. After that experience, I will never look at the gimmick unknown the same way again. They say that only the first generations have folk tales and legends, but the second generation have shown me how unpleasant the truth can be. I eventually enjoyed Soul Silver immediately, but I still can't unthink that the rigged game has told me. A little girl sat in her room. Her messy brown hair was put into a little pigtails. As her hazel eyes stared at the door, she hugged her stuffed giraffe close to her little body and listened closely to the loud yells of her father and mother. I never should have had damn kids! Screamed out loud in a deep voice. All they do is make messes, complain, and draw on the walls! He was interrupted by a shrill and angry yells of the girl's mother. They're children, David. They don't know any better. Oh, fuck me, Beth. I don't want to hear a bullshit excuse. I've had just about enough of them. And all you plan to do about it. The girl heard the footsteps coming towards her room, and she hugged her giraffe closer. The door opened violently, and in the doorway stood her large, infatuated, overweight father. In one of his meaty hands, he held a large textbook. David, stop it, screamed the mother. But her father ignored his wife's pleading cries. He grabbed the little girl harshly by the collar, and she screamed and kicked, trembled in fear. The girl's father held up the textbook. This is your drawing on my fucking walls, you little bitch! Years later, the little girl, known as Natalie, was now 9 years old, going through the stage of puberty. She was naturally a little chubby. Like the usual, she sat in her room watching TV. Her dad was ranting about some economic crap that she really could give less shit about. As she munched on some popcorn, she was also currently drawing a picture There was a bit of gore in it, but strangely she liked the drawing of blood. It gave her some weird satisfaction, other than the fact that multitasking was no problem for her. It became apparent to her at a young age, after to do some much hard work and labor, that she was able to do so many things at once. Drawing ending up being her talent and passion. It was her way from escaping from reality whenever something bad would rear in the ugly head and peer in, or when she was simply bored. She suddenly heard the closing of their door and looked to the left. Pausing on a munching on her popcorn, there stood her brother, Lucas, who was 14 years old. "What is it?" She could still hear her father yelling from the outside of her door. "Dad, scaring you?" He let out a chuckle. "No way. I think we're both used to him yelling by now." There was a long pause. "So why are you in here?" He played with his sleeve slightly and twitched a bit. "I have to ask you something." He trained his eyes on her. She frowned slightly, growing impatient with her brother interrupting her movie and drawing. "What?" He moved a little closer. "You said you wanted to be cool and grown up. Like a teenager, right?" She nodded and suddenly brightened up slightly. "Well, I have an offer." "Spit it out, you dimwit." "You know what guys and girls do together sometimes, right?" The next day at school, Natalie did not say a word. She did not speak for the whole day. She did not have anyone to speak to anyways. Nobody knew. Nobody should know. And so nobody would know. Her teacher picked up on a few of her puzzled expressions, but she dismissed it, as if she did not understand the lesson. Natalie also felt as if she was in severe pain. She had no idea it could hurt. Feeling scared, she walked home silently, went to her room, but later in that day, she was once again greeted by her brother. Nobody would know. At school, she finally decided to tell someone, even though they weren't her friends. She just felt she had to. She walked up to a group of girls she would occasionally see in the hallway. They looked like nice girls, and they and Natalie had occasionally talked before. "Hey, Mia." The ginger girl looked over at Natalie with a straight face. "Yeah?" Mia said to Natalie. I really need to talk to you about something. It's been going on for a while, and you and your friends, well, I feel like you're the only people I can trust." Mia and her friends seemed to pull little smirks, but only for a moment. Little Natalie knew that they were hungry for gossip. "All right, you can trust us. What's up?" One day later was all it took. She had been getting consistent remarks on social network sites such as Facebook one time, sometimes even called her a whore, not to mention their lunch had ended up getting in her hair. It was going to be the least of her problems. But Natalie, being only 9, could not help but be greatly upset at the fact. However, she did not cut, she did not peep, and she never said a word about it. As you may recall, so far in this journey, she had kept everything inside. She supposed it was better. She wouldn't let any pain get the best of her. At 3 a.m., school night, her mother was going to kill her. The girls know, as Natalie was now 16. She was productive in high school, close to honor roll. For once, she felt calm and happy. Though the usual, she would occasionally become a hermit in her room, hiding away from her dad, who still liked to consistently yell and scream about economy, money, and politics, and all of the other bullshit that she was flat out tired of hearing. Her eyes started to feel heavy, and she had an assignment to work on. But that was no longer important to her. All that was on her mind was sleep. She closed her laptop, and after her eyes adjusted to the darkness slightly, she saw her old worn-down stuffed giraffe in the corner. She stared at it. In complete and utter silence, memories passed through her mind, and she felt tears coming to her eyes. But quickly, she blinked them back. No more breaking, she thought to herself. But she continued to stare at it. What the fuck are you looking at? She said to the stuffed object. It simply stared back with soft, black, beady eyes. She shook her head and stood up. She now looked sadly at the little toy animal and gently picked it up in her arms. She cradled it and spoke softly to it. I'm sorry. Some tears ran down her face. She patted rough, short fur softly as she lay down on her bed. She slowly went to sleep. She was awoken by the angry growls of her mother. Exhausted, she slowly opened one of her eyes. I can't believe I forgot to take that laptop away. You were on all night, weren't you? Natalie sighed and pressed her face deeper into a pillow, hugging her giraffe closer. Her mother sighed and walked out. She took a shower, brushed her teeth, and ate some breakfast. Then she got dressed. She put on a gray and blue hoodie with a fur inside the hood. It was her favorite, but it was the only one she could wear to school due to the others being in the wash. She also put on a black jeans and some thin fashionable boots. Finally, she went down to the stairs to get driven to school. She hopped down in the car. Her mom sped off. However, on the way there, due to the lack of sleep, she slowly put her head against the window and the car began to drift off. Her dreams are more accurately nightmares, consistent firstly of her physical abuse as a child, and secondly of the sexual abuse she had suffered at the hands of her own brother, Lucas. The abuse had lasted for 4 years before she had the guts to turn him away. She started twitching and cringing in her sleep, but her mother took no notice. Her mother never took notice. Suddenly, she was jolted awake by the sound of her mother's voice. "We're here," her mother said with annoyance in her voice, most likely from catching Natalie napping again. She looked at the large sign at the school, which read Walkerville College Institute for the Creative Fine Arts. She sighed tirelessly and stepped out, putting her backpack on her shoulder. "See ya," she proclaimed and closed the car door. She walked into the school and chatted with a couple of friends until she went up to her locker on the 3rd floor. She grabbed her books, and before the 5 minutes of the time was over, she ran to class. Her English teacher annoyingly put her hand on Natalie's desk. "Where's your assignment, Miss Outlet?" Natalie swallowed. I forgot it at home. Sorry, Miss Holnook." "Your time is up, Miss Outlet. Don't disappoint me." Natalie seemed puzzled by the thought for a moment. She didn't know why, but those words seemed to melt through her. She simply ignored it and went back to listening the lesson and falling asleep not into long after. Of course, later that day, she was heading to her locker for 4th period, and suddenly her boyfriend Chris approached her. "Hey, talk to me after school, alright?" She smiled. She loved talking to Chris. At that time, she didn't suspect anything. Chris was always sweet to her. During her French class, Natalie failed to pay attention. Instead, she doodled to things she loved to draw the most. Blood, gore, people being stabbed, knives, and macabre being of some sort. Others would say it was pretty dark and to her draw such things, but she saw nothing wrong with it for some reason, strange reasons. It actually felt like a normal thing to her. "Miss Outlet?" She quickly covered her doodle with her paper and looked at her French teacher, quickly trying to hide her fear. Yes, Miss Levasseur?" With a slight turn of his head, he gestured for her to move her arm. "Show me your work." She hesitantly moved her arm over, showing her teacher the picture of something getting stabbed in by an insane man. The teacher stared puzzled, looking at her a bit. She smiled nervously. "Erase that and get started with your work," he said in a strange, calm voice. He walked away and sighed and began to erase the picture, and Miss Atlas, Mr. Levesser, interrupted. She looked up at him slightly. "Your time is almost up to get your work done. I suggest doing it now." She growled at the remark. The time always seemed to be against her. As far as she was concerned, time could go fuck itself. After class, she walked out of the school to find her boyfriend standing near the fence on the sidewalk. She smiled and walked over, hoping he had something to say that would cheer her up on her miserable day. But as she walked closer, her smile slowly faded. He wasn't smiling back. "Chris, what's wrong? What did you want to talk to me about?" He sighed. "Natalie, I think it's time that we should start seeing other people." She felt her heart break. "But why?" Natalie cried. He responded with a stern look. "It's your mindset, your drawings. They just creep me out. I think there's really something wrong with you, and the saddest part is that you haven't told me why you're acting like this. It makes me feel irresponsible, so I can't do it anymore. I'm sorry." And with that, he walked away. Natalie slammed her hands on the bedroom counter at home. She stared at herself in the mirror, her eyes twitching. I won't hurt myself like the others. I can't stay strong." There was a needle and black thread in her hand. "It's pointless. It doesn't help." Some weird sensation pulled at her subconscious. She chuckled slightly. "No one. I know I'm doing it because I want to." She held up the needle with thread at the end and smirked. "Time is up." Piece after piece after cut, even through the excruciating pain, was going through her. She did not whine. She did not whimper. She did not cry. There was no more tears she shed. All she did was smile. Blood leaked from the pierce and made a low dripping noise into a sink into the counter. When she was finished, she stood back and admired her handiwork. She stroked the horrendous stitches on the side of her mouth, which separated into a wide smile. She felt the warm, wet blood on her fingers and licked it gently, consuming the metallic-tasting liquid in the pure ecstasy. She stopped when she saw her mother's reflection in the mirror behind her, and sharply turned around and saw her mother's wide eyes and pale face. As she looked at her fingers, seeing the blood, she suddenly felt the pain and began to cry. "Mom," Natalie cried. She had never felt so confused. What had just happened to her? Her mother had scheduled some therapy for Natalie, had not gotten rid of the stitches, in fear of how much pain it would bring, so she went into the sessions with them. She made sure her hood was up, as to not let anyone else see. She sat down on the comfortable leather seat and stared at the blonde woman across her in the silence. "So, your name's Natalie, isn't it?" Natalie nodded. "I'm Deborah, and I'm here to help. Now tell me, Natalie, what have been some of your problems recently?" Natalie stared. Time has been my problem," Deborah gave her a confused look. "What about time, dear?" Natalie's hands roughly gripped the leather seat. "Everything. It makes your lives through it. Slowly progressing through life, being controlled by society, only to be tortured by seemingly no end. until you find no longer have purpose. It's a vicious cycle. Time does not end. It does not slow down. It does not speed up. It is violent. It makes you live through the torture over and over again, unable to fast forward through any of it. Natalie really had no idea what she had said. She felt like she wasn't herself anymore. Could this be because of all the things she had kept contained? No, that was impossible. But for some strange reason, she liked it. The therapist leaned in closer. "Sweetheart, I want you to tell me what happened to you." Natalie continued staring. There was a long pause. She smirked slightly. The wounds from her stitches opened slightly. Once again, "Why didn't you tell me, Blondie? You're the expert." Deborah appeared mildly annoyed. "Natalie, I can't help you unless you help. What's wrong?" Natalie's fingers started to tear into the leather seating. "Natalie isn't here anymore." With that, Deborah's eyes widened and she rose to her feet. "I'll be right back. Please stay here." She walked out, leaving Natalie alone. Maybe if she had done something at this point, she wouldn't have come to what she is today. Maybe more people would be alive, and maybe she would be sane, like she had been before. As much as I would love to say that Natalie got up from that chair and stopped what came next from happening, I am obliged to give you the horrid truth. Natalie did not move. She sat perfectly still in total silence and absolutely calm in that chair. And after a while of waiting impatiently, her parents walked in. Natalie stood in, happy to go, but she never noticed her parents' expression. Even her father had a strange, saddened expression on her face. Her confusion grew, but she said nothing and followed them to the car. On the way, while she thought she was going back home, she started to drift off. Strangely, she heard a dark voice speak in her dream. It almost sounded like her own, echoing onto an eternal abyss. "Your time is up." She shot awake, some beads of sweat rolling down her face. She wasn't home. She wasn't in her car. She was in bed, a white bed, in a white room. She looked to her side and realized she was hooked up to a heart monitor. She attempted to get up, but that's when she realized that she was restrained. She panicked. She began to struggle, but paused when she heard the door open to her left. A man in a white shirt looked at her, his hands behind his back, and he resembled one of those cliched doctors you would see in a television program set in a scientific lab. She paid full attention as Mr. Scientist started to speak. "I can only imagine how very confused you are right now," he said, "but I'm letting you know we're only here to help. Your parents agreed to allow us to administer our medication to you in hopes of helping your state of mind." Natalie opened her mouth to protest, but was quickly silenced. "You don't need to worry," the doctor sought to reassure her. "You'll hold back to a normal in no time. Just try to relax." He walked over. As he did, she tried to skittish away, but unable to the leather straps binding her wrists and legs. He carefully took a mask and put it over her mouth and nose. She stubbornly tried to get it off, but she felt herself starting to slip under the drugs kicking in, and slowly her eyes shut. Suddenly Natalie woke up. She couldn't comprehend what she was seeing. She was being given multiple injections, and something has been rubbing on her skin. She felt woozy, but otherwise completely aware of her surroundings. She was entering a rare state of patience, sometimes finding themselves in a while undergoing surgery, in which they are able to see they are being worked on. In this state, they can feel the pain and their brain is active, but they are unable to respond. Natalie, however, was able to. Her heart rate began to accelerate, as reflected on the nearby monitor, and the doctors took notice of this. They looked at her and took notice of opening her eyes. One of the doctors yelled at another. Natalie couldn't make out what they were saying, but suddenly felt a rush of adrenaline shaking violently. She slowly started to slip out of her bonds, and the doctors moved to her down, but then hesitated to do so. Natalie watched as all three of the doctors backed away. She sat on the edge of the bed, and the IV tube from her arm and mask from her face. She got to her feet and started to stumble towards them. Her breath hinged and her vision was blurred. She was vaguely aware by then that she was chuckling with a madman, but suddenly she felt searing pain in her chest. She was gripping her chest in agony and dropped to her knees. She coughed off blood, fell prostrate of the floor, blacked out. Natalie woke up slowly, groggling. Sometime later, she found herself back in bed, and the doctor sitting beside it. "I'm so sorry, Natalie. Something went horribly wrong." Natalie didn't know why, but she felt a tremendous amount of hatred towards the doctor. He took notice of disgust and looked away instantly. "You were supposed to wake up while we were giving you the dosage of the mental state." The doctor continued, "We aren't sure how it will affect you, but we have a feeling we're going to find out." He paused for a moment before talking out a small mirror the entire time. He looked away from her regrettably. "The medication impacted your appearance as well." Natalie looked at herself in the mirror and her eyes widened. Her eyes were completely green. She noticed she still had some stitches in her mouth as well. But for some reason, she couldn't help but feel overjoyed. Her heart rate began to rise again. She gave a low chuckle. The doctor looked on in a shock. Natalie quickly moved over to him until close enough for him to feel her breath. Doctor began to still chuckling. He trembled slightly and pressed a button on the underside of the monitor. Yes, he stammered in reply. "Your time is up." A loud scream was heard through the halls of the facility. 2 security guards rushed into the room, kicking the door open. Blood. Blood was the first thing they saw. Blood on the walls, blood on the bed, on the floor, even the ceiling. Natalie was strapped the doctor to her bed. The bed was bent in a sharp angle, and the doctor's spine was completely snapped. The blood poured from his eyes, nose, and mouth. And there, in the corner, was the murderer, happily drawing a gruesome picture on the wall in blood. A long, hastily scrawled face. "Your time is up." Natalie slowly turned to the guards, and a whining, crazy grin spread across from her face. "Hello, friends. Would you like to play?" And with that, Natalie began laughing uncontrollably. The guards quickly drew their guns before they could act. Natalie charged at one of them, and one of the guards fired a round, and Natalie was able to dodge it. She grabbed a large knife from a sheath on her pocket and slashed it across the waistline. Blood and organs flooded out and collapsed. She inhaled deeply, loving the damp stench of death. She remained guard shook, and the fierce drop of his gun. She slowly walked up to him and placed the tip of his knife against his chest. "Your time is up." She slowly slid the knife down his chest all the way to the end of his abdomen. His organs spilled out onto the floor and collapsed dead. Natalie's mother has been sleeping soundly in her room beside her husband. She awoke to the sound of knocking on her door. She groggily got up and walked out of the bedroom and to the front door. It was pouring outside, and thunder boomed in the distance. She approached the door, but paused before grabbing the knob. She detected a faint sound of insane laughter. The rain and thunder seemed to quiet down suddenly. She pressed her ears against the door and listened closely. "Hello, Mother," a voice from the other side called out. Natalie burst through the door, wielding 2 knives. her mother stumbled back, hitting her head against a nearby coat racket. One of the hooks penetrated her skull. She bled considerably from the resulting of the wound. She fell to the ground paralyzed, but still conscious, lay in the pool of her own blood. Natalie tore over her, and then knelt slowly to meet her mother eye level, and displayed her blood-soaking blade proudly. "I was suffering, Mother," Natalie cooed. She ran to the tip of her knife across her mother's cheek, cutting it slightly. Natalie tilted her head. "But you did nothing." All her mother could do was shake and gasp like a fish out of the water. Natalie grabbed her mother gently and laid her flat on the ground. From there, she straddled her and began to cutting a V into her chest. Her mother could only gasp and shake, the life drained from her. She choked and gurgled, and her breath became labored. Natalie knew she didn't have much time. She proceeded to forcibly open her mother's chest cavity with a loud crack, reached and grabbed her mother's still beating heart. With her bare hands, it pulsed, were growing fathers and fathers apart. Suddenly, she ripped it out. Blood sprang all over her face. She stared her mother directly in her face as she took her final breaths. "Sweet dreams," she said to her mother's corpse. "Your time was up." She put the heart into her mother's mouth, patted her cheek softly, and stood up. She wasn't done yet. Natalie's father had stirred awake and realized that his wife was not returned to bed yet. His eyes only just adjusted to the darkness when he suddenly noticed Natalie standing at the beside with a crazed smirk plastered on his face, and her newly green-tinted eyes glowing in the darkness. She was covered in blood and the scent of unbearable. She frowned dramatically. "Oh, dear mother's gone. I wonder who will get the money," Natalie jeered. She swiftly grabbed her father's forehead and laughed maniacally. "That's all you ever cared about anyways." Her father, unlike her mother, was a fighter, and sprung up and grabbed Natalie by the neck and threw her to the ground. He started to stomp her chest until she coughed up blood, and she stared down at her. "Doesn't it feel good, Daddy?" she laughed. It spit in violence and coughed up more blood after all. "You never seemed to mind doing it all these years ago, did you?" He narrowed his eyes. "You aren't my daughter!" A wider smirk spread across her face and peered at him with luminous eyes, blood dripping from her mouth. "You're right, I'm not." She suddenly tripped him, causing him to fall hard to the floor. She scrambled to her feet, knives in hand. They say the bigger you are, the harder they fall. While she was winded, she grabbed the pillow and stuffed it into his face, and then stumped on it, harder and harder until a loud cracking noise could be heard. Then she finally pulled the pillow away. Her father's face was gruesomely mutilated, and he was making muffled noise and crying in agony. "What's the matter, Daddy? Pain too much for you?" She shoved both knives into his stomach and left him there, then moved to rip one of the large, heavy wooden poles from the bed and set it down to her father's leg and withdrew the knife. "Gonna need these." She chuckled and sat down upon the pole and laid on his legs. Suddenly, she stared to the rock back while sitting down. She weighed from her body, and the pole slowly started to squeeze his innards up through his body. He started to gag, and the blood poured from his mouth. His breath was silenced, and she hit a bit of a snag. Come on," she snarled, as she forced herself to rock back and with more weight. Suddenly his organs burst out of his mouth. The nasty gore piled onto the floor on the side of his face. She nodded to his carcass and started to walk out. Your time was up, Daddy. Finally, this would be her favorite part. She quietly snuck down to her brother's room, silently opening the door, blood dripping from her knife, making a low tapping sound as the droplets hit her hard wood. Her brother wasn't in bed. It was apparent that he must be hiding somewhere. She grinned. Oh, dear brother. Come now. She started to walk inside. All I want to do is have a little fun. As she stepped in more, she listened closely for any sounds, any breathing, any moving. She stiffened the air and protrudes scent. And the closer she listened, she finally noticed something, a faint breathing noise. Whack. She fell to the ground trembling. Her brother was behind her with a now bloodied baseball bat. He was gargling down with anger, panting with rage. She tried to slowly get up, but he hit her again and again and again. Mother always did like you the best, you bitch! He hit her harder one last time before taking a breather. She was bleeding heavily. Her green eyes drooped and glowed faintly in the darkness. She felt weak and looked closer up at the ceiling. She recalled the days she had spent in here, being tortured, having to go through it 4 years, looking at the same damn ceiling. It sent a sudden rush of energy into her body, and she started to stand, laughing insanely. Her brother went in to hit her again, but used both of her knives to block it. You're going to hell, brother. With a large push, she sent her brother flying onto the bed. His head hit against the wall, growling angrily, about to lunge at her when she stabbed 2 knives into his arms, keeping him pinned on the wall. He screamed and struggled rapidly. Let's see how we can use here. She started looking around the room and smirked at the simple butter knife on his bedside. She picked it up and walked over to him. They say the eyes are the softest organs on the body. She slowly licked the knife. Soft as butter. He looked in horror, trying to get away, and started to dig his eyes with the knife. He shrieked loudly, and she quickly tied the cloth around his mouth. Now, we can't have you waking the neighbors. He wasn't able to see anything. The pain was unbearable. Blood leaked violently from his eye sockets. He would cry, but now was incapable. She dug around for a few more times and picked up a pair of scissors. She walked over to him and crawled over him. I think you need to cut loose, brother. She stabbed the scissors into his guts, and he cried out a muffled scream of pain. She treated him like crafts and arts, cutting his skin like paper. She lifted his large intestines and smirked wickedly. You know what I love? Macaroni art. She started to cut the intestines into sections. These might be a little too big to put on a plate, though. She could hear his brother foaming blood from his mouth. However, he had to swallow the blood back because of the cloth around his mouth. Doesn't that taste good? She licked his blood off her fingers. I'm sure I like it. He let out another muffled scream. She went down to his toes and started to crack them and ripping them off, one by one. After a while, his scream grew futile. His throat was raw of blood now. Next, she worked on his fingers, snapping them and ripping them off slowly. The gurgling came louder and started to squirm. He was choking on his own blood. She pulled the cloth down, and blood poured from his mouth and turned his head to the side and vomited violently. There, brother, she said, patting his head. Eat this and feel better. She stuffed one of his fingers down his mouth and making it jam into his throat. He choked slowly and died. Your time was up. The girl known as Natalie, walking into a room dripping blood. Off to the corner, she saw it. Her stuffed giraffe. She kneeled down and stared at it. Then, without a word, she stood back up and walked to the bathroom, staring at herself, covered in blood. She heard a faint tickling noise. She looked down and saw a pocket watch. She stared at his hand, slowly turning, listening to the tick, for what seemed like an eternity. She took out one of her now red knives. As it heavily dripped blood onto the counter, she grabbed the pocket watch and disassembled the watch until only the small clock was left. "Time to make you live through the torture," she said, slowly bringing the knife up to her eye. Slowly progressing through life, being controlled by society, she started to slowly dig into her eyes, as the vision in her left eye grew blurry and red, until you find no longer having purpose. She felt like her eye started to come free from its socket, blood pouring into the sink. "It's a vicious cycle." She left it dangle out of her socket in a sharp pain where it was connected to her head. Time does not speed up. It does not slow down. It is violent. She grabbed onto the cord of her eye and tore it right off, the eye falling into the sink. It makes you live through the torture over and over again. She started to place the clock in her eye, unable to fast forward away from it. There was a squishing sound and drips of blood until it seemed the clock fit perfectly in her socket. I am Clockwork. The young 16-year-old girl, formerly known as Natalie, walked away from her burning house. The flame engulfed everything, and the inside of the giraffe slowly burned along with the carcass of the family. Some say she still lives on, carrying her insanity with her, leaving so many dead, saying she decided when their time should come to the end. The only way to detect her presence is if you cuddle close into the covers of night, sleeping soundly. But in the darkness, she watches, she determines. You hear ticking, and you see a green flash of that putrid clock eye. If she is there, you know your time is up.